Hello, good afternoon. I just got off a plane from Israel yesterday, so forgive me if I lose my train of thought at any moment. All of our hearts are in the East and in here and also on the West Side, so thank you. I want to thank everyone at Recharging Reform and Amplify and everybody who made this happen today. I really am thanking you for your vision and your courage in understanding what our community needs at this moment, and it is absolutely an honor to be part of writing this new chapter together with all of you. I'm very lucky to speak to a lot of different audiences in both the Jewish and non-Jewish worlds. So I thought I would start this afternoon with a story from a talk that I gave a year ago that's very much the opposite of this one, or at least the people hosting me thought it would be. I was invited to speak to the entire student body of a prestigious prep school on the topic of anti-Semitism. And from the many panicked phone calls that I received before that talk, I found out why I had been invited. After a series of anti-Semitic incidents at the school, Jewish parents and alumni had presented the school with a list of suggestions of how to address this problem, inviting me to speak to their student body for exactly 25 minutes was the only suggestion that the school had approved. So I have to say this was kind of a big lift for me, considering that at that point, my most recent work that was coming out was a comic book about a talking goat. When I met on Zoom with the administrators before this event to discuss how I would use my precious 25 minutes, they were clearly very nervous. And one of them gave me advice that I will always remember. She said, "During your remarks, we strongly advise that you avoid using the Z word, because that might offend people." Yes, the Z word. I looked at her and I said, in that case, should I also avoid using the J word? Because of course I would not want to offend people who hate Jews. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I ignored her advice and I went ahead at that school and I used the Z word, because you cannot tell the story of the Jewish people without it. And you cannot claim that you are fighting anti-Semitism if you only care about half the world's Jews, or if you deny the fact of Jewish peoplehood. And that is what I want to talk with you about today, telling the story, as you heard from Noam, of the Jewish people, of Am Yisrael. But I want to speak first about how we got to this point where this is even a question, and what this moment we're in now demands of us. For the past 2.5 years, many of us have lamented what appears to be the end of the so-called golden age of American Jews. In the Atlantic article by the journalist Franklin Foer on this topic, he wrote about how anti-Semitism receded in America after the horrors of the Holocaust, but now it's returning. And he used that passive language. Anti-Semitism receded like the tide. And I am here to tell you it's not true. There are actual sociological studies of American non-Jews in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and those sociological studies demonstrate that no non-Jews in America felt bad about the Holocaust. None. What actually brought about the so-called golden age of American Jews was courageous American Jewish activism and proactive education. High-risk lawsuits, government lobbying, policy activism, and also American rabbis, yes, rabbis, educating the public by writing books and articles for magazines like Life that introduced and explained Judaism to a broader American public. My friend Rachel Gordon, who's a professor at the University of Florida, has a great book called Post-War Stories that describes all of this. We are all beneficiaries of that activism and that education. And I think it really demonstrates how powerful our community's leadership can be in changing our own reality. But that success came at a very high price, and we are still paying that price today. The price was this. American Jewish leaders at that time made a conscious decision to rebrand being Jewish as a religion. In the Reform movement, of course, this choice goes back to the Pittsburgh platform in the late 1800s, which was then adjusted in the 1930s to accept Zionism. But after World War II, it was also conservative and Orthodox leaders making this claim. And it made sense at the time. Their goal was to distance themselves from how Nazis had defined the Jews as a race, and it was a very good political choice at a time when America was, of course, fighting the godless Soviets. The problem is that Jews aren't a religion. Millions of Jews worldwide are secular. Have you ever met a secular Mormon? You haven't, because Mormonism is a religion. Jews have a religion, but we are not a religion. And claiming that Jews are simply a religion requires removing some of the deepest aspects of Jewish life that have sustained us for thousands of years. It is amazing to me, in my travels across America talking about Jewish life, that almost no one I meet is able to answer the very basic question, who are Jews? And that is because no one has ever told them. In my public talks for non-Jewish audiences, I'm often asked, are Jews a religion? Are Jews a nationality? Are Jews an ethnicity? The answer is not complicated. It's just old. Jews predate all of those categories. Jews are, in fact, a type of social group that was common in the ancient world, very uncommon today. Jews are a joinable tribal group with a shared history, homeland, and culture. That was a sentence in English. And in Hebrew, it's one word and it's 2 letters long. Thank you. Jews are Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. If people don't understand this basic category of Am Yisrael, they become vulnerable to every single anti-Jewish lie. Because contemporary anti-Jewish ideology is actually an attack on the idea of Jewish peoplehood. Our American Jewish community today is radically different now than it was in the middle of the last century when our community's leaders made this choice. And it is now time for a software update. The story we have been telling ourselves for the last 80 years about who we are as American Jews has made it impossible for our children to understand what is happening to our community right now, which is an attack on the existence, endurance, and resilience of the Jewish people. And that is where our new story of Am Yisrael needs to begin. As you know, I am the author of a book called People Love Dead Jews. I still cannot believe my publisher let me keep this title. But I can tell you that my next book's title is even worse. It is coming out in September, and it's called The Final Solution to the Jewish Question. I wish I were kidding. Different publisher, they put up with it. The premise of People Love Dead Jews was that Jews are only acceptable to a non-Jewish society if Jews have no power, whether that means they're politically impotent or dead. And that is why the minute you say Israel, everyone loses their minds, because Jews are not allowed to have power or agency. We have not taught our children the truth, which is that our agency and our choices, which we have consciously cultivated all through our history against enormous odds, are the only reason that we are Jews, and also the only reason our story matters to us and to everyone else. For a long time, I thought that the solution to this problem was to focus on living Jews. Because, of course, this is what happened to me, was after I made this stupid mistake when I published People Love Dead Jews. Because I had previously published 5 novels. It was my first nonfiction book. And I didn't know that when you write a nonfiction book about a problem, people expect you to solve the problem at the end of the book. And I hadn't done that. So every single person is asking me, what's your solution to this problem? And my obnoxious answer was, do you really want me to give you the final solution to the Jewish question? And that's what I'm doing for my next book. So for a long time, I was thinking about how to solve this problem. And at first I thought, we should be teaching people more about living Jews and the positive aspects of Jewish life. And plenty of talented educators have told me they want to focus on the joy instead of the oi. And they will say things like, instead of focusing on these negatives like anti-Semitism, we should be teaching about things like Hanukkah. And then I kind of thought, well, what do you think Hanukkah's about? The more I thought about this divide, the supposed divide between the positive approach about Jewish life and the negative approach about anti-Semitism, the more I understood how artificial that divide is. And it also started thinking about the mistakes that a previous generation made in trying to teach people not to be bigoted, when they often would say, this is about bias, it's about bigotry, you shouldn't hate the Jews because they're just like everyone else. Of course, the problem is that Jews spent 3,000 years not being like everyone else. Uncoolness is Judaism's brand. This has been true for thousands of years. And so this brings us to the more interesting question. Why did Jews spend 3,000 years not being like everyone else? Instead of vanishing into dominant empires and societies like almost every other ancient group, what made people commit to that high-cost, countercultural choice then and now? These questions brought me to my breakthrough. I came to understand that these supposedly distinct topics, Jewish life and culture on one hand, including Israel and Zionism, and historical and contemporary anti-Semitism on the other, they are not actually separate stories. They are one story, which happens to be one of the greatest stories on earth. It's the story that lies at the foundation of freedom. It is the only reason why anything about this 0.02% of the world's population should matter to anyone at all. Here is the story we need to be telling our children. This is the story of a tiny group of people whose groundbreaking ideas shaped world history. The first of those ideas was monotheism, the covenant between God and Am Yisrael. And all those things sound like a religion to you, but these are actually political ideas. Because in the ancient world, societies had many, many gods, and sometimes one of those gods was the dictator. Even in societies where the dictator wasn't considered divine, the dictator was at the center of the cult, placed above the people. But the contract, the covenant between Am Yisrael and this one God was not for the royalty, it was not for the priests, it was for the entire people, all of Am Yisrael. We do not today appreciate how radical this idea is. When the Jews in the ancient world said that they do not bow to other gods, what that meant is that they do not bow to tyrants. Jewish civilization is an anti-tyrannical movement, a nonconformist movement, an anti-hierarchical movement. It's a movement based on a story of liberation that taught the world that freedom is possible. It's a movement based on laws and debate and civil discourse that taught the world that freedom requires responsibility. These foundational ideas of Jewish civilization are inseparable from the history of anti-Semitism for 2,200 years or more. Because when you have an anti-tyrannical movement, it pisses off tyrants. When you have a nonconformist movement, it pisses off dominant societies that need everybody to conform in order to validate themselves. When you have a movement based on interpreting laws through argument and civil discourse, it pisses off people who can't tolerate debate or dissent. The story of anti-Semitism is entirely consistent for thousands of years and entirely inseparable from Jewish civilization because it all traces back to the Jewish people's radical proposition that people do not need to conform or agree, that people do not need to bow to tyrants. And people who want to dominate will see this as a threat. Anti-Semitism is not just a social prejudice or a conspiracy theory. It is a lie that people use to gain or maintain power. The big lie against the Jewish people is always exactly the same. The big lie is that Jews are destroying what your society values the most. And the only thing that changes through history in different eras, different social circles, different settings, is what your society values the most. This lie is directly related to the threat that the Jewish people have always posed to the idea of conformity and blind submission. It is a lie told by people who need to dominate, whether those people are middle schoolers, social influencers, or full-blown despots. It is a lie that benefits people who need to crush dissent. It takes a lot of courage to resist that lie when everyone around you believes that it's true. That courage and resistance is what the Jewish people have always carried with them. Every Jew alive today is a descendant of people who made that brave countercultural choice. And every Jew alive today is still making that choice now. I think that what is unusual and extraordinary about the story of the Jewish people is not the litany of horror that the Jews have experienced, because quite frankly, humans do terrible things to each other, and there isn't a group in human history that hasn't experienced those things. What is unusual about Jewish history is the resilience of the Jewish community in surviving those things, in always building and teaching our children how to build again. I think we're often branded as the chosen people, but the reality is the Jewish people are the choosing people, because our ancestors made these choices over and over again over thousands of years to maintain this civilization against dominant societies that tried to denigrate and destroy it. These are conscious choices because there is nothing organic about maintaining a counterculture over thousands of years when you are surrounded by people making every possible effort to make you stop. I could speak here about the specifics of those choices, which I would break into three things the Jews chose to maintain at enormous expense: literacy, community, and memory. And what I would highlight here is how none of those things can be separated from the land of Israel. They are all nonsensical without it. If you start with memory, think for a moment of how difficult it was to maintain Judaism's land-based traditions during thousands of years of exile in other locations and climates. Imagine what it meant for our ancestors to try to get a lulav and etrog every year in a place like Poland, when there was no imported produce. How were they doing this? Imagine what it meant for our ancestors to live in a sukkah in October in Siberia. Think of the connections between Jewish communities that Am Yisrael has maintained for thousands of years, long before modern communication. There was a system of smoke signals connecting the Sanhedrin on the Temple Mount with communities in Babylonia. Later, there were assigned Talmudic sages who traveled back and forth between Israel and Babylonia to share Torah teachings. Today, we think that it's totally normal that there were people in Warsaw and Marrakesh and New York who were all singing Lecha Dodi, which was written in the 1500s in Sfat, in the land of Israel, because Jewish communities have always been interconnected with each other and with the land of Israel. And finally, there's literacy. This was a community teaching its children to read 1,000 years before the printing press, when nobody else did that, when it was an expensive choice, a countercultural choice. I don't know why this just died. Maybe I killed it. Should I try that one? I don't know. I'll just be loud. Literacy, which was based on maintaining our language of Hebrew. We're going to go with this one. How's that? Better? Okay. All right. Literacy, which was, there we go, yep. Literacy was based on maintaining this language of Hebrew, the only indigenous language still spoken anywhere in the Levant. The only language where archaeologists unearthed the very same text that my son learned for his bar mitzvah last year. All of these are choices reflecting the Jewish people's power and agency. These were decisions that were unpopular, inconvenient, expensive, sometimes even dangerous. Zionism, of course, is the pinnacle of those choices. There's a lot I could say about this, but what I want to say is there's a lot of ways that you can look at Zionism as a typical national movement from the 19th and 20th centuries. What is so unusual about it is that Israel did not succumb to the tyrannical regimes and later, including today, the aspiring Islamist empire that surrounded it. As all of our friends and relatives in Israel know, this takes tremendous courage, and it is that courage that continues to inspire the world. Today, most people on our planet still live under autocratic regimes. The brave Iranian dissidents have flown Israeli flags at their protests. They are inspired by the courage of Am Yisrael, because Am Yisrael is the civilization that proved to the world that people don't need to bow to tyrants. We are still proving that now. There is much more I can say about this, but I want to say that there's a reason that Jews from places like Syria and Iran and the former Soviet Union have not fallen for the mass movement, the mass campaign of billions and billions of dollars from autocratic regimes overseas that have colonized all of our children's phones to try to convince us that Zionism is some sort of aberration from world history. There's a reason that Jews from places like Iran have not fallen for this, because their families lived through the persecutions of anti-Zionism in the same way that many Ashkenazi Jewish families lived through Nazi anti-Semitism. And so Jews from those places see anti-Zionism clearly for the annihilating anti-Jewish ideology that it is. Imagine if we had taught our children to recognize the abject racism at the heart of anti-Zionism, its history of persecuting and annihilating Jewish communities around the world by using the same slogans we're hearing today. Imagine if we had taught them about that the same way that we familiarized them with the slogans of Nazi persecution. If we had done that, I don't think that any of our children would have fallen for it. The story of both Zionism and Am Yisrael is a continuous story of how Jews have stood up to tyranny and empires for thousands of years. It is one story of courage and creativity and choices that honors the ultimate commandment in the Torah, which is to choose life. I founded the Tell Institute to tell that one story. I named it for the idea of an archaeological tell, the hill made of layers of the past, but also for the English word for storytelling, telling it like it is, telling a friend, and the tell that reveals when someone is lying to you. Our team of very talented and experienced educators have created a short set of 8 accessible lessons. They're adaptable for different courses, grade levels in high schools and middle schools, and also for Jewish community settings like B'nai Mitzvah cohorts. Our first non-Jewish public school teachers and students who tried it this past year found it game-changing because it is a fascinating story, not of victimhood, but of courage and choices. But we realize that today's Jewish students need this story the most because too many of our own children do not know this story. We have left them vulnerable to the lies of the tyrannical regimes that are populating the phones in their pockets. No more. We are changing this now in our new B'nai Mitzvah program, this short set of lessons, which already I'm proud to say was piloted here in Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. At our workshops here at this conference, as many of you know, we've been offering a sneak peek at this material and a possibility of piloting it in your communities. It is so far past time to teach our communities and our children what the Z word really means and who we actually are. Because like all of the traditions of our people, Am Yisrael, it is the antidote to tyranny. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and in conversation with all of you who are kept up at night by anxieties similar to my own, and to share the stage with Dara and Noam, who are both inspirations to me. Dara said something very interesting just now. She said that the Iranian people, Jews in Iran, are hanging on to their traditions and Judaism and their love of Israel, and there are examples of devotion and dedication to these ideas. You'd be shocked to know that there was an article in Times of Israel or one publication saying that based on the reports that come out of Iran and interviews that journalists have conducted with Iranian Jews in synagogues, anti-Zionism has found roots within the Iranian Jewish community. And there's nothing more absurd than this, because the Iranian Jewish community since 1979 has had the same script by which they handle all journalists, and anyone who falls for anything else is just a fool. So I thought I'd just let you know that anytime we fail at telling our story, which is what you do, is when other people hijack our stories and our concepts and everything else that we should be the ones to define. Okay, on that, I leave that tangent behind. I had decided that I was going to call this talk by a working title, which was going to be, Dear Reform Rabbis, what on God's earth were you thinking? But I decided to set that aside. Ordinarily, the job of a respondent is to make a counter-argument. But instead, I'd like to linger over one of the central ideas that Dara presented, on the notion of how Jewish monotheism was an anti-tyrannical idea in its own time, and as such, threatened the societal norms and structures. This certainly is an important part of anti-Semitism's origin story. Following the logic of this argument, centuries later, in a world where monotheism is widespread and anti-Semitism is once again reaching alarming heights, we must wonder, what now? What is it about the Jews, the Z word especially, that so many find still so offensive? How do the Jews threaten today's established order, as monotheism once did? To answer this, I must begin on a personal note. On a planning call a few weeks ago discussing the flow of today's events, Rabbi Tracy Kaplowitz insisted that I mention that I was born and raised in Iran and came of age during the 1979 revolution and its cataclysmic aftermath. But that fact is relevant to our discussion today only in the following way. I left Iran in 1984, and I've spent the last decades trying to make sense of what I witnessed. What was it that drew Iranians to the streets to do to themselves, to ourselves, a damage from which we have not recovered, a damage from which the region and the world have been reeling ever since? To be an Iranian, especially in diaspora, is to belong to a tragic and enigmatic community. Iranians are among the top 10 most successful immigrant groups in America. They are among the richest and most educated nearly everywhere they've gone. And no wonder. Iran is one of the world's greatest civilizations and in a region where the borders of some countries were artificially delineated by colonial powers in the 20th century, Iran has long possessed a strong, continuous sense of national identity. Iran is also the only nation in the Middle East. Some people argue over this with me, and I'm ready to take it on if you want to challenge me on this. Iran is also the only nation in the Middle East with a long-standing history and tradition of civil rights movement that dates to the middle of the 19th century, a movement that was inspired by the European Enlightenment and committed to fighting against the influence of clergy in politics, separation of mosque and state, and the rule of law. This tradition runs so deep that nearly every uprising and protest movement since then traces itself to that origin, what later came to be known as the constitutional movement. With this rich heritage and resourceful community in diaspora, the question that haunts me, the question that I'm often asked is, how can a people with so much talent, education, and wealth have a terrorist cabal ruling their country? Only recently have I arrived at something resembling an answer. Until 2023, my inner world was never an easy blend of my disparate heritages. The two versions of me had long been running in parallel on separate tracks, the Jewish and the Iranian tracks. And like all parallel lines, they never met. But on October 7, they collided. As I watched Kalashnikov-wielding thugs shove Noam Weissman into a van, the soundtrack of the events stopped me cold. Chants of Allahu Akbar filled the air. These were the same words that I first heard as a little girl standing on the rooftop of our home in Tehran in the final weeks of 1978. It was this chant that had foreshadowed the ruin of my birth country. And it was the same chant that, on October 7th, threatened to do the same to the country of my hopes. My two separate universes finally met at the nexus of this shared evil. And suddenly, it became impossible not to ask, why can't Iranians liberate themselves from the regime whose poison keeps spreading? Until October 7th, it had never occurred to me to compare the Iranian diaspora of today with the Jewish diaspora of the late 19th century. But now, in the face of a common existential enemy, it seemed so essential to try to understand why the Jews had succeeded where so many others, including Iranians, have failed. How did a ragtag collection of persecuted Jews emerge from Kishinev and countless other assaults to gather at Basel? And against all odds, agree on a plan, and then, against even greater odds, to execute that plan? How did so many Jews from throughout the diaspora heed the call to what was then only a pipe dream and emigrated to British-mandated Palestine? For 48 years, the Iranian diaspora, with all its incredible resources, has not done a fraction of that. For 48 years, despite great horrors, whose dimensions we have yet to know, it has not managed to build a unified political movement. I can't help sharing this as one instance of all those tragedies, if only to honor the memory of those who perished last January in Iran. Did you know that during the January 7 and 8 uprisings in Iran, the regime shut down all access, not just to the internet, but also to the Iranian equivalent of 911 and the fire department? That it arrested doctors who treated the wounded, and its thugs went from clinic to clinic, shooting the injured in their hospital beds. On October 7th, besieged Israelis were hoping for the IDF to reach them. On January 7th, besieged Iranians were hoping that the IRGC would not reach them. In light of all this, why has this community not been able to organize itself? The more I looked at the history of liberation movements, the more unsettling my conclusion became, which sadly is this: most liberation movements never succeed. The rule is, in fact, to fail. It's the successes that are the exceptions. Examples of these failures abound. All of the Middle Eastern countries that rose up during the Arab Spring. The same is true about the Russian anti-war efforts, whose leader, Alexei Navalny, was killed in a Russian prison. There were the uprisings in the Caucasus, including Georgia and Belarus. And let's not forget, Cuba and Venezuela. And last but not least, there was China and the events of Tiananmen. And I'm not even touching on Africa. The list is painfully long. We remember the fairy tale successes, but they are rare. And even many of those successes arrived with the wind of history on their backs. Gandhi and Mandela confronted decaying imperial systems whose moral legitimacy had already begun collapsing. It was only a matter of time before the majority local population got rid of the minority overlords. Martin Luther King and the American Civil Rights Movement, too, was an inevitability because the hypocrisy of white-only democracy had run its course. Hindsight is 2020, but Eastern European liberation movements, starting with the fall of the Berlin Wall, occurred just as the Soviet Union had hollowed itself from within. None of this diminishes the staggering achievements of these movements, only to say that history, at certain moments, can't help but move in a direction that societal evolution demands. But against the Russian army, which has been sending thousands of its own soldiers to their deaths every month since the start of the war with Ukraine, without Vladimir Putin blinking an eye, with Iranian regime massacring thousands in the span of 48 hours, and then go on the very next day to speak of its own righteousness and divine mandate, the idea that has become increasingly clear isn't that Iranians have failed, it's that the successes are anomalies. Yet, even against the backdrop of all other exceptional liberation successes, Zionism is exceptionally exceptional. Unlike India, South Africa, the US, or Europe, the Zionists were not trying to reform the societies in which they lived. They had betrayed the Jews too many times, and their laws had never really served them. The Zionists did not rise against the rulers. They did something else. They imagined a new life, a new society in a new land, and they were determined to will it into existence. It should have been as unthinkable for them as it is today for the Tibetans, Rohingyas, or the Uyghurs. But in addition to their singular determination and vision, history also briefly handed them a catastrophic advantage: the Holocaust, which weighed, however fleetingly, on the conscience of the global community. Religious skeptics often ask, if God really exists, why has he not performed any of his miracles lately? But what's the parting of the sea compared to the miracle of a group of impoverished new immigrants who could barely make the ends meet, but decide, as early as in 1912, that they must found a university in the desert, which becomes Technion? Who needs a swarm of lice or locusts when you have a stubborn man, Eliezer ben Yehuda, who breathes life into an ancient language and makes Hebrew live again? Once we had supernatural miracles, now we have civilizational ones. It is surely a matter of personal taste, but I go for the latter category any day. And this, I think, brings us back to Dara's point. If monotheism threatened the tyrannies of the ancient time, imagine how threatening Zionism is to modern tyrannies, regimes that have spent decades convincing their own people that freedom, prosperity, democracy, and pluralism can't take root in the Middle East, only to watch the Jews create precisely those things before their eyes next door. And Israel, for all its flaws, remains a standing rebuke to every dictatorship in the region that denies its populace of dignity and freedom. I speak of Zionism as a liberation movement because Zionism was never merely about the right of Jews to self-determination. That thin, bureaucratic definition is what the enemies of Zionism have reduced it to. It is what they do with many other concepts relating to Jews, most recently and dangerously to the notion of genocide. But I digress. At its inception, Zionism was about far more. It meant to create a state that would help, in Theodor Herzl's words, the world to be freer by our liberty, richer by our wealth, greater by our greatness. And this, ladies and gentlemen, in a region full of ideological tyrannies and deceitful autocrats, is a very dangerous idea. The conception and execution of the Zionist dream is a staggering development for the 20th century, as it is the invention of electricity, airplanes, or the internet. Zionists did not just gain freedom, they invented their own freedom brand. A few weeks ago, the writer Elena Newhouse published a beautiful essay called "Zionism is for Everyone," arguing, in part, that the kind of society that Israelis built became the envy and therefore the target of so much hatred. I agree, but I think the hatred predates what we have come to know as modern Israeli society. It begins with not just the mere existence of Jewish agency, but the exercise of Jewish imagination. The thinking up of something, a liberation of a kind that has been rare, if not unprecedented, if in all of history, to establish a democracy that beats even the communists at their utopian dream of communal living. Thus far, I've argued for why Zionism, why Israel is exceptional in the story of its inception and the achievement of its people. And yet, as adamant as we must be about the extraordinary nature of Israel's creation as a state, we must be equally adamant about Israel's ordinariness as a government. Israel, the state, is a unique human achievement. Israel, the government, is a government like any other. it is capable of corruption, extremism, moral failure, and abuse of power. And when those things occur, Jews, like citizens of any democracy, must protest, argue, expose wrongdoing, and vote governments out. When it does those things, the job of every Jew throughout Israel and beyond is to assure that corrupt government which conducts itself immorally is ousted in the same way we do in any other country, including the United States. Abandoning or disowning Israel are not options. To demand moral perfection only from Israel is itself a form of ghettoization. It removes Israel from the normal community of nations and turns Jews once again into an abstraction rather than a people. To accept the premise is to play by the rules of the anti-Semites. It is here that the words of David Ben-Gurion reveal their prescient meaning. I quote, "When Israel has its own whores and thieves, will be a state just like any other." Well, 78 years later, those whores and thieves in the opportunists, fanatics, and extremists are in high office. Just as we have them in US, sorry. Is it okay to use the word whore here? Okay. Just as we have them in US, Germany, Hungary, Italy, and so many other democracies. The responsibility of Israelis and Jews is not to sever ties, but to fight for the soul of the society as citizens do everywhere else. Because to walk away from Israel entirely is to allow anti-Zionists to dictate the terms of Jewish belonging and engagement. Sometimes an Israeli government can resemble your alcoholic uncle. You sign him up for rehab, but you still must invite him to Thanksgiving. I don't know if it's a good metaphor, but I had to make something up. Sorry? Okay. And increasingly, this abandonment is being carried out in the name of progressivism. Yet it is precisely this obsessive singling out of Israel that has become one of the great moral failures of much of the contemporary left. The inability to place Israel within the same moral framework applied to every other flawed democracy has profoundly distorted progressive politics itself. It is this rabid anti-Zionism that has kept progressives from being progressives. So the struggle against anti-Zionism is not only about defending Israel, it is also about restoring moral coherence to liberalism itself. Thank you.
In my 11th grade history class, Dr. Chase said to me, "Noam, you were sitting in the front, I was sitting in the middle." He said, "You are a thorn between two roses." I had two lovely ladies by my side, but that's how he described me. I feel like now I'm the thorn between two bulldozers. That's how I feel right now. Dara, your words are strong, They make us think. They make us grapple. Roya, your words are poetic. Feels like you're listening to a ballet. In words, it's very, very special. I want to ask a few questions to the two of you, and I have the privilege to be able to ask these questions and not answer these questions. But I'm going to riff off of things that the two of you said. And Dara, I'm going to start with you and ask you, I think, a question that's been on my mind, and I think a question that's been on a lot of people's minds. On February 4th, 2026, meaning a few months ago, there was an article in the JTA that cited a JFNA study. And the study said that 9 out of 10 Jews strongly support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish democratic state. Yet at the same time, just over a third of Jews positively identify as Zionists. And just today, my team has been grappling with this article in the forward. I don't know if you guys saw it, but it's just today, that said, let's see if I can find it. That said, almost half of American Jews under 35 say the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should be solved by creating a single country in Israel, the West Bank and Gaza, with a government elected by both Israelis and Palestinians. The findings signal a generational shift in U.S. support for a bi-national state in Israel, reflecting a core demand of anti-Zionist protests on college campuses and beyond. That's from today. So I want to ask you, what does this mean to you? What does it mean to you? Should we, it's a question I get asked often, the person that asked you to speak at this independent school, and I get this often as well when I go to independent schools, they say, please drop the Z word. So I want to ask you, what is the utility of the Z word, of Zionism? How do we, and should we be utilizing the Z word, the Zionism word, and make an argument for it beyond what you said? Because if 9 out of 10 Jews strongly support a Jewish and democratic state, and 2/3 do not identify as Zionist, then there's a problem in something. What's the problem and what's the solve?
They're dumb. Yeah. No one ever told them. Time to tell them. Yeah. Like I said, we've been teaching about religion this whole time. Yeah, they're dumb. It's our job to tell them. Let's just drop the word. You know something? In the 19th century, and actually a lot of the 20th century, the J word was the problem. In the 19th century, I have a chapter about this in my next book, there were almost no Jewish organizations that used the word Jewish to describe themselves. All the 19th century organizations were like B'nai B'rith, National Board of Israelites. There was all the Jewish newspapers in the 19th century had names like the Hebrew Messenger, the American Israelite, even Union for Reform Judaism. I was at the biennial for the Reform movement in 2002. That's when they changed their name from Union of American Hebrew Congregations, only in 2002. Because guess why? Hating idiots had turned Jew into a slur. What does Jew mean? It means grateful to God. Why would we let people, why are we letting Nazi idiots take away our words and our language? I'm sitting next to my daughter. I have 4 children, my oldest 2 are in college. I'm sitting next to one of my college-aged kids in shul in the year, in fall of 23 or 24. And she's just sitting next to me in shul and going through the liturgy of the Siddur. And it's every single page it says, Israel, Zion, Jerusalem. She just is pointing to each one. She goes, it's almost like it's part of our culture. I think it's part of our culture. Why would I let haters take that away? Why the hell would I do that?
Roya.
Can I answer the same question?
Yeah, you could do that.
Yes.
I can?
Yeah.
Sure.
But I still have another question for you.
Okay. No, honestly, I don't want to derail you. Okay. So one of the things that I unfortunately have had to do, despite my own inclinations, is to play the part of a political commentator lately. I mean, not lately, but for the past several years. And that's been to explain sort of Iran and what's happening and all that to the rest of the world. And one of the things that I've consistently said is if the United States chooses a path of isolation, if the United States decides to withdraw from the Middle East or elsewhere, the place that it leaves behind will not stay as a vacuum. It will be filled with the Chinese, with the Russians, and everybody else. So, thank you. The same is true about every time we as Jews fail to proactively teach and talk about Israel and Zionism and the Jewish history. Because while we seem to be at peace with our society, we have never been at peace. This is all some facade. We are and have been at a war with Islamism. And while we've been in the United States thinking, oh, you know, it's all the way over there, it has never been just over there. They are actively have been directing their propaganda and ideology at our society, at Jews, at America. And if you think, I know you don't, but I want to press this, this isn't just about Zionism and Israel. So if as parents or as educators, you give up and give in to agreeing that the Z word is a bad word, the next one will be US imperialism, and the one after that would be Americanism, and all the other things that make up Western civilization. So,
Roya, the question I wanted to ask you is about Iran and Israel. You had this very poetic articulation of 10-7 versus 1-7. I like that a lot. And I like to talk about Israel and the way people...
No, I'm sorry. When you say poetic, you're not saying that it's not, you know, thoughtful.
No, it's like, wait, how many adjectives do I need? Thoughtful, intentional...
No.
Yeah.
I mean, I appreciate poetry.
But you're a brilliant writer. I'm sorry. Jeez, okay. All right. A brilliant writer, Roya. So, and thoughtful.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So, Roya...
Yes.
I want to talk about prior to 10-7 because I've been teaching the history of Israel for a long time. And my dissertation is actually about how Jewish perception of Israel has existed and shifted over time and how to reach young Jews compared to the different generations. And it bothers me a lot that people talk about everything post 10-7. Because what I've seen, and there's a study that was done by Eitan Hirsch, which I love, from 2021, and he points out that 18 to 30-year-old very liberal people, not Jews, that there is a study that was done by Eitan Hirsch where they looked at American allies, Nigeria, Mexico, Israel, and compared American perception of those countries to countries like Iran, China, and others. And what this study shows prior to 10-7 is that very liberal 18 to 30-year-olds have a more positive perception prior to 10-7 of Iran, an enemy of the United States, than Israel. Mm-hmm. Prior to 10-7, I will stress that. Why? What's the reason you compared and contrasted the stories of 10-7 and hoping for Sahel to be there versus 1-7 hoping for IRGC to not be there? So why? What's the reason behind that?
We probably owe this, not probably, really likely owe this to the anti-colonialist curriculum at a lot of our universities and in our humanities departments. But there is one story, I don't remember if I talked about this on your podcast or not, but I think all of you need to take this story away with you and begin talking about it within your communities, just so everybody understands that we are at war, even when it looks like we are at peace, and that this war has been going on without us being aware of it for more than 50 years. So here's the story. In 1962, Ayatollah Khomeini, for the young ones among you, the guy who led the Iranian Revolution and overthrew the monarchy in Iran, in 1962, he was this really unpopular cleric in the equivalent of Iran's Vatican. Sorry, I shouldn't compare Vatican to Qom, but Qom is a city where all the seminaries in Iran are. And Ayatollah Khomeini was issuing these fiery sermons about the size of women's skirts. He was really pissed off that Iran had modernized and women were gaining rights and the skirts were getting shorter and shorter. So he was issuing these sermons about moral corruption in Iran, and he wasn't gathering momentum. Nobody was really paying attention to him. It was, the society was reforming and moving forward and westernizing and all that, and who wanted to hear from this backward mullah, right? A year later, the Iranian parliament passes a law which gives immunity to all American servicemen and just any American, diplomats and none, who were in Iran. And this caused Ayatollah Khomeini to issue a new sermon. And in his new sermon, he says these words: right now, an American dog has more rights in Iran, more dignity than a Muslim. And right now, the Zionists, the blood-sucking Zionists and American imperialists have more say in our politics than Muslims do. From that moment onward, he gathered momentum. It wasn't about the size of the women's skirts. And the thing that happened next was that all the leftists who used to think that he was a backward mullah, all of a sudden saw in him a national leader. And if you think the red and the green came together on October 7th, you just don't know the history well enough. This started in Iran. It may have started even earlier, but it certainly was something that Ayatollah Khomeini, coined in Iran. And in this way, in his hatred for Israel, hatred for America, he brought the anti-imperialist left together with the ultra-conservatives in Iran. And we are living in a world that began to be made for us 50-some years later. So this fight is an old fight. We are the ones who are just becoming aware of it. That's our disadvantage.
Fascinating.
You can interrupt me.
No.
I go on.
All right, I'm gonna pause for a second and go to Dara. We got a question from the audience. I like this question because I think it's really important that we don't just talk to ourselves and hear a reflection of what we see in the room. And I think this is probably a group that is, broadly speaking, unified in many, many ways with different opinions. But there's a question here for you that maybe is for people that aren't in the room. Okay, Dara? And here, I'm going to read it exactly as is. Leftists, socialists, and communists, and anti-Zionists might say that your anti-tyrannical reading of the Jewish story affirms their political stances and arguments. How would you respond to them?
Wait, so Team Jihad is saying that the story of anti-tyranny is theirs? I'm confused with the question.
So I'm not here to defend the question one way or the other, but I will tell you my read of the question, my charitable reading of the question that I understand. That right now there is a power that be, whether that's Israel or the United States of America, and these are strong powers. And they view themselves as this concept of Ivri Anochi, I'm standing across the river. I'm not going to go with the tide. I'm going to actually assert my values. Okay. And one of those values is to make sure that we're going to fight whatever the tyranny of the day is. What would you respond to that?
I agree. And when you look at a map of the Middle East, find me a country within 800 miles that doesn't persecute its minorities, doesn't persecute women, doesn't execute protesters. Find me a country on any of Israel's borders, on anywhere within 1,000 miles. I think find me those, and all of those countries being sponsored by the Iranian government, by the Qataris. When we say, like, what is the power? Look at a map. Look at a map. Is Hamas this little underling startup thing? No, it is a proxy of Iran, right? I mean, this is like the idea, or is it a little people that's fighting for freedom? They're literally executing anyone who doesn't agree with them. So like, why is this even an argument? Like, why are we wasting time talking about this? It's like Team Jihad is telling us that, like, we're the ones who are tyrannical. Like, why are we even having this conversation? Why are we entertaining this with a response? I guess that's what I want to know. Yeah.
That's how Dara feels about that. That's how Dara would respond.
I mean, like,
so
honestly, I just don't understand, why are we arguing the merits of Team Jihad versus Israel or America? Like, it just seems bizarre to me.
Noted. I'm going to wrap up my thoughts. Note to self: don't ask a question from a flashcard without reading it first and asking Dara. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up.
Did I not answer it?
No, you nailed it. You nailed it. I'm going to wrap up the conversation with a quick thought that I have as listening to the two of you. I was in Atlanta a few months ago, and I was speaking to a school there, to a group of 9th graders, and then I had a live Unpacking Israeli History show that evening. To the 9th graders, I said, Isabella Tabarovsky said the following: I want all young people to become refuseniks. I looked around the 9th graders, and I said, who's going to fight for the refuseniks? They all looked at me, said, what in the world is a refusenik? Not one student knew what a refusenik was. In the evening, I told the history of Zionism, the story of the history of Zionism. And I told the story of the refuseniks, and I asked them this question: how many of you have heard of the refuseniks? Every hand went up. How many of you were part of fighting on behalf of Soviet Jewry in the 60s, 70s, and 80s? Either they raised their hands or they said, my parent was. And I looked at them and I said, how is it possible that I just spoke to your children and they have no idea what a refusenik is? We have to tell our stories. The only thing, Dara, I will slightly, as moderator, slightly disagree with, I do not think that the young people are dumb. I do not think that that's the case.
Ignorant.
I believe that it is our job to teach the story of Zionism.
That's what we're doing. Yep.
That is our job.
Yes.
And if we make sure that we cannot ask them to represent Zionism if they don't know what Zionism represents. And that's our job here. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you.